Greetings and welcome to the COVID-19 Training Network. We are presenting a series called Cultural Humility to Build Competency Training for Pro Bono Attorneys to Represent Diverse Low-Income Clients. It's my pleasure to do today's section, which is on intersectionality. My name is Tanya Douglas. I work at Manhattan Legal Services, which is part of Legal Services NYC. The largest provider of civil legal services in the country. At Manhattan Legal Services, I am the director of the Disability Advocacy Project, as well as our Veteran Justice Project, and also do a lot of work around diversity, equity, and inclusion at Legal Services NYC, and in a variety of other forums in New York State, as well as nationally. So once again, this is a section that will be focusing on intersectionality. And the goal is to provide some information on how to best represent low-income diverse clients. Intersectionality is, we'll go into what does it mean and why is it relevant to pro bono representation of diverse low-income clients in a second. But I just wanted to let everyone know if they're not familiar with the term, that is part of what's called critical race theory. And it was actually started by a legal scholar who's known as Professor Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. And it's a legal framework for understanding the ways that the multiple aspects of our identities can intersect, influence one another, and compound to create unique experiences. The concept is used fairly regularly to describe the ways that societal privilege and oppression is complicated by the different parts of our identity that can be marginalized or privileged in society. In 1989, and I'll talk a little bit about this, Kimberly Crenshaw wrote a piece called Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex. It was a Black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, and the information is found right in front of you. It's Feminist Theory and Anti-Racist Politics. It's at the University of Chicago Law Forum, volume 1989, issue 1, article 8. I really recommend folks read this, but I will briefly just describe what it does. It attempts to look at the issue of discrimination through a particular lens. A lens that was not often looked at, and I'll go into this slide in just a second, but it is looking at, Professor Crenshaw looked at how racism and feminism were trying to describe experiences around discrimination that affected women, but did not fully encompass all the experiences. In particular, Black women, racism sometimes also often looked at the issue of how a particular race was discriminated against, such as African Americans, but often meant men. And oftentimes, sexism looked at how women, particularly white women, were discriminated against, but did not actually encompass the experiences of Black women. This article that I've mentioned, please do read it again. It actually goes through a series of cases which are very interesting and are useful as you were working with low-income diverse clients, one of which had to do with D. Granville versus General Motors. And in that case, an African-American woman alleged discrimination against General Motors. General Motors' position was that they did not discriminate. Their position was, we hire Blacks, happened to be that all of the Blacks were men. They also said we hired women, just happened that all of the women were white. The court refused to look at this particular claim of a Black woman from that perspective, how she was discriminated as being Black and a woman, and basically said that those two things would be giving someone like 2 bites at the apple. So this article does a really good job in trying to get the law to do what we all wanted to do, and that's to provide justice, and that's what we're asking you as doing pro bono work. So the next slide talks a little bit about this. So basically, discrimination often doesn't happen in the way that the legal field has thought about it. So in reality, discrimination can happen on more than one axis or identity. Blacks or African Americans can be discriminated against based on their race, women are discriminated against based on their gender identity. However, Black women often experience discrimination based on both their race and gender. And so intersectionality is looking at how to have a qualitative analytical framework that identifies interlocking systems of power and how they affect those who are marginalized or multiple identities, in this case, race and gender. So in 1989, Professor Crenshaw coined this term, and this particular slide actually shows one of the challenges, as well as this slide shows race and gender as being separate. But in 1989, she was talking about how Black women are discriminated based on both race and gender. And this slide shows how the two can intersect. And just to give you some more information, it grew out of trying to conceptualize the way the law can respond to when both race and discrimination are involved. And so in some ways, and this is an apt description, it was like what happened in terms of discrimination was like an accident, a collision. Intersectionality simply came from the idea that if you're standing in the pathway of multiple forms of exclusion, you're likely to get hit by both, and not just one. So these women who were Black women were injured, but when the race ambulance came and the gender ambulance arrived at the scene, they're like, oh, these are women of color lying at the intersection of race and gender, and said, we can't figure out if it was just race or just sex discrimination, and unless they can show us which one it was, we can't help them. So take a minute to think about that. You had people who were discriminated against, Black women, and they alleged their discrimination based on race and gender. And the legal system was not able to address how to provide relief based on both of those axes. So over 30 years ago, this term was formed primarily to look at how Black women were discriminated against and not having any form of relief within the legal system. So I want to talk to you why you have to think about these concepts. So why is intersectionality important to pro bono representation of low-income clients? It's important for many, many reasons. The first, and I'm going to spend a little time on this, is how to achieve competent and zealous representation of low-income diverse clients. As attorneys, you're used to representing clients. Those competency skills are great, but this is a different type of skill set, and it's a journey that you are on. Some of you may have been on this diversity and cultural humility journey a little bit longer than others, and others may just be started. But we want folks to know that it's really important to think about how do you develop these skills? How do you provide a more holistic representation so that you are not missing any aspects? So working with low-income clients who are diverse, they may experience legal issues in ways very different than some of your current clients. And so what part of this is to have you to develop an awareness of this difference and to value how to have an intersectional lens. And it's a learned skill. It's not something that you're born with. It's not acquired. It requires practice, and you will be getting practice as you're taking on these cases. There will be also other sessions and opportunities for you to reach out. It also requires an awareness. We all have our own filter. We all look at things through our particular lens, and that particular filter can cause us to have blind spots. So when we're talking about intersectionality, and 30 years ago, there was that blind spot, as you can see. Race and gender were seen as different, two very different identities that didn't intersect, but underneath you actually see they do. As someone who identifies by both her race and her gender, I understand how discrimination can happen to a Black woman that would not happen to a Black man or would not happen to white women, but it's still discrimination, and discrimination that needs to be addressed. So I want to also let you look at intersectionality as it has evolved. So Professor Crenshaw started out with intersectionality, dealing with how Black women were not included within the legal system's ability to provide relief, at least within some jurists' ability to see that. And then intersectionality, as any critical theory would start to evolve. And it realizes that there are other intersecting pieces. So race and gender, but also class. And so this is very relevant because you will be working with low-income clients who may be of diverse races and different genders, and understanding, and it'll be really important to understand how those particular identities can intersect, how it would be important to think about any implicit biases that you may have about those particular areas, and any filters that you may have that may cause blind spots. The goal is, how can you help? How can you make it better? As attorneys, our jobs are to help clients, and to do public interest work is part of how do we achieve social justice for clients who are often denied based on their race or their gender or their class, or all three. So that's why it's important for you to have this lens, and also just to move, this concept has evolved. One of the materials that you will read is, or have an opportunity to listen to, is a TED Talk by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, where she actually talks about how it has evolved. And I'm going to go into this diagram in a little bit. So 30 years ago, she realized that there was a void. And that void had to do with discrimination against Black women. But of course, intersectionality has evolved with her permission, the person who coined it, as it should be when you're talking about issues of power and privilege, about how we need to realize there's so many different intersecting identities. So as you're working with low-income clients, I just want to go, this is one diagram. You may see others, but just to take a little bit of time to understand. So income is clearly one, right? So income is you are working with low-income clients who may have limited abilities because of their income to interact with you, and to be cognizant of that, and to be concerned whether that is now during this time period that there's going to be the digital divide. So they may not have access to computers, or they may have limited access to computers, or their ability to communicate with them is only by phone, and that may even be limited based on what type of phone system they have, whether they're limited minutes, and these are things that probably don't come up with other clients. The issue around race, how is race may be a factor in some of the cases you're working on. Ethnicity, race and ethnicity are different, how that comes into play. Issues around language. You may work with clients who speak different languages, and I know there's a section that you'll be looking at on language access, and realizing what that means. People who who are not maybe English proficient, but who speak other languages, and understanding the ability to represent clients competently. Issues around immigration status, heritage, education. All of these things will impact. Also, issues around, there could be an intersecting identity is gender, and also gender is different from gender identity or sexuality. Also locality, right? Some of the clients will be in more rural areas, some will be in more urban areas. All of those impact age. Older clients, and also the abilities of clients, right? Some are more, some may have more challenges in terms of physical or mental. So as you're having this intersectional lens, it's important to think about how all these things come into play. And as to doing pro bono work, and you're representing clients, thinking, is this a factor in their claim? Or is this a factor in how I'm going to understand how best to represent them? The need to have that lens is really important. And while I think the pictures we have shown has been helpful, we're going to take a few minutes to look at a video, which will actually help put this into better perspective. And it's about a particular client, looking at that client's various intersecting identities.
Kay Wandai Barrett, activist, cultural worker, and disability justice advocate. Race and disability, race and gender, race and class. I can't go to a store or a doctor's office or a date and not be seen as brown, trans with a cane. There's no way. And I'm not going to choose any of those things. I do not want to minimize or dictate how people live and experience and identify. Intersectionality is really super critical to me. I'm not just attacked because I'm trans. I'm attacked because I'm brown and I'm disabled. People are being imprisoned, criminalized, harmed, not given jobs, not given medical support. They're not adequately being loved. It's critical that we get those resources, and it's critical that we get those resources from that community. Every day I'll be on a train and someone will, try to get a seat at the, disability access seating. And depending on that person, depending on how they see me and my masculinity, right? Brown masculinity is not supposed to be vulnerable. Gender nonconformity, are you a boy or a girl? And then I'm young, so you're not really disabled. So all of these things are coming into play on a frequent basis. And that happens when I'm at the medical office, when I'm with the doctor, how many times I'm misgendered. So if they see my brownness, we just want to talk about your brownness. When I'm in white queer spaces, it's like, let's just talk about you being transgender or queer. When I'm in very able-bodied, fit, radical people of color spaces, they don't really want to discuss access or the needs of my community being disabled. Real talk, white people are treated very different in the trans community than brown people, than black people, than Latino people. Real talk, people with disabilities, oftentimes it's a lot of white people, cis-sexual, rich people who can afford healthcare, and that is not my community. For me, what's super pivotal is to acknowledge that race doesn't just move everything along, but that it interprets and informs all the other parts of me. It's because somebody is brown and trans. It is because somebody is physically disabled or perceived as
have a little bit of
crazy, right, and brown. B, cis-sexism, and C, anti-blackness or racism, right? So all of those things are tools, are weapons happening simultaneously on me, on you. I think it's really critical that we engage in dialogue that might make us uncomfortable. If we don't address that depth, our level of depth, and also the level of depth to which we are being harmed and limited, I don't think we're going to be able to really do groundbreaking work or innovative work to address our needs. And in order to do so, we have to not just see race in a vacuum.
That was a powerful video. It was an illustration of how intersectionality has evolved. This is from Professor Kimberly Crenshaw's work at the African American Policy Forum. So looking at intersectionality now, it's systems we're talking about based on people's various identities. It's racism, it's classism, it's sex, it's ableism, colonialism, heterosexualism. And that video showed a big number of these identities. So think about this as you're representing your clients who are diverse, the different intersecting identities that they may have, how best to work with them, whether it's using appropriate pronouns. You see in the bottom of my screen, I use she, her, and hers. Some people have preferred pronouns, some have none. So thinking about that's an intersectionality, and doing this representation also requires developing a rapport. And so lastly, I want to thank everyone for participating and just leave you with some resources that would be useful, which is on our last slide. So there is what's called the African American Policy Forum. That's their website. They also have a blog and a podcast. There's also Diversity Toolkit and the Race Forward, raceforward.org, which did the video. I would recommend using all of these and many others as you develop your cultural humility skills. The idea is that you can never become competent in another person's culture, but you can learn to be more humble, more respectful. And for example, the AAPF has had a weekly series looking at the racial disparities that are affecting clients during COVID-19, some of whom you may see and may have possible COVID-19 claims, all of these materials are recorded. You can listen to them or watch them, or as I said, put as a podcast. So once again, thank you for your work. In advance, for low-income clients, do reach out to those who can provide assistance, including all of us who are working on this together. Thank you very much. Look forward to working with you in the future.